Lecture number 7. You should be beginning on slide 64. In this lecture, we want to continue our discussion of the initial return of those Jews who first returned from Babylon to Jerusalem. We've already reviewed the leaders of the returning group, and we've said a word about Sheshbazzar as well as Zerubbabel. And now there's a few other items that we want to talk about as we come near the end of chapter 2 of the book of Ezra. Slide 65. If you look at the registration list that is given in Ezra, you'll discover in chapter 2 and verse 2, there is a list of 11 names. These seem to be leaders of the group, and of course the first one listed is Zerubbabel, and the second one is Joshua, who is the high priest. This list of names, of 11 names, is the same as the list that you will find in 2 other parallel passages, with one proviso, and that is that the list in Ezra seems to be one name short. If you look at the parallel list in Nehemiah chapter 7 and verse 7, you will find all of the 11 names that you find in Ezra, plus one extra name, which is the name of Nehemiah. And if you look in the apocryphal book of 1st Esdras, chapter 5 and verse 8, you will again find the list of names. Again, 11 of them will be identical to the ones that you find in Ezra, plus there is this one extra name, Nehemiah. It seems likely that it would be 12 leaders who would be listed as those heading the group coming from Babylon to Jerusalem rather than 11. And that is because the number 12 was so sacrosanct for the Jews. 12 was the number of the sons of Jacob. It was the number of the tribes of Israel. And even though there were various fluctuations of the tribes throughout their history of the last several hundred years, nonetheless, the people of Israel are always considered to be the 12 tribes. And so it is probable then that the leaders who came back from Babylon to Jerusalem would have been 12 in number to symbolize the traditional number of the clans of Israel. Those returning from Babylon to Jerusalem would be considered a remnant, and this remnant was to symbolize the whole nation. And so 12 leaders seems appropriate in that sense. A couple of minor points should be given in this list, particularly with respect to the 2 names Nehemiah and Mordecai. The Nehemiah in this list in Ezra chapter 2 and verse 2 is probably not the same as the Nehemiah whose book we will take a look at a bit later. Nehemiah, who was the governor of the later part of those who returned and who formerly was the cupbearer to Artaxerxes. So we should understand this to be a different Nehemiah than the one who will come later. And secondly, we also probably should not understand the Mordecai to be the uncle of Esther in the book of Esther. Mordecai figures significantly in the book of Esther as a prominent figure, but he did not come from the area of Babylon back to Jerusalem, but stayed in the heartland of Persia, as the book of Esther seems to indicate. Slide 66. As you read the list of names of those who came back from Babylon to Jerusalem in Ezra chapter 2, the people who came back can be divided into 2 broad categories. Pure Israelites, those whose pedigrees could be validated, and then those with unclear status. So we first of all want to talk a little bit about the pure Israelites, which is the list beginning in verse 3 all the way down through verse 58. And these fall into basically 3 subdivisions. The first subdivision from chapter 2, verse 3 through verse 20 describes those Jews who had verifiable genealogies, and that probably means written genealogies that had been recorded and preserved in writing throughout the exile. When you get to verse 21, however, you'll notice that the people listed there are listed by towns rather than by parentage. The men of Bethlehem, and after that, of course, is a list of quite a number of other towns. These people also were those considered to have pure ancestral roots because they had a pedigree that could be directly linked to an Israelite town. So if they had clear Israelite parentage, or if they came from a clearly Israelite town in which their parentage had lived before the exile, then they were considered to be pure Israelites. The third subcategory are those connected with the first temple. These would be priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, temple servants, those kinds of people whose ancestry went all the way back to the first temple of Solomon and whose parents perhaps or grandparents had served in the first temple. And of course, priests and Levites of various sorts were given status because of their genealogy. The priests were descended from Aaron all the way back in the time of Moses, and the Levites, of course, came from the tribe of Levi, which were designated to be associated with the temple and the various work that had to be conducted at the temple. The second large category, which begins in verse 59, are those with unclear status. Now, these people claimed also to be pure Israelites, but they could not demonstrate the purity of their ancestry, either by locating their ancestors in a particular Israelite town or by some sort of written genealogy. So, though their claim was recognized, they could not be included as pure Israelites, and yet they weren't excluded because of their claim. And so what they were given was a kind of probationary status until their claim to pure Israelite ancestry could be validated. And this validation, since they didn't have any written records, was going to be by the use of Urim and Thummim, these instruments of decision-making that belonged to the high priest. We'll say a little bit more about these implements in a moment or two. Those with unclear status also can be subdivided into two general categories. Those who could not demonstrate their genealogies from the general run of the tribes of Israel, and those who claimed to be part of the priesthood but could not establish and validate their claims. And so you find those two categories, verses 59 and 60, sort of the general tribal mention, and then from verse 61 through 63, those who had unvalidated claims for priesthood. Slide 67. We need to say a word then about the Urim and Thummim, because specifically it is these instruments that would have been decisive in determining whether or not those with unvalidated ancestry could be accepted as pure Israelites. The priestly implements of Urim and Thummim go all the way back to the time of Moses and Aaron, and they were some sort of implements that were stored in the breastplate of the high priest, according to Exodus chapter 28. We don't know what they look like. They are not described. They are only named. However, we would assume that they were relatively small, since if they were stored in the breastplate of the high priest, they couldn't have been very large. And there are references to them in various books of the Old Testament, not only in the book of Exodus and Leviticus, but also in the book of Numbers. You find them in use. You find them in use in the book of Judges. You find them in use several times in the book of 1 Samuel and a few times in the book of 2 Samuel. Whatever these implements were, they were used to arrive at decisions in ways that depended upon God to make the decision. According to the tradition preserved by Flavius Josephus, they were believed to be gemstones. Now, I should say a word about Flavius Josephus in case you are not familiar with him as a person. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century A.D. He would have been probably partly contemporary with St. Paul, and while he was not a Christian, he did preserve many of the traditions and records of the Jews that were extant in his time period. Josephus actually began his career as a military man, but after the defeat of the first Jewish revolt, he took up the latter years of his life by writing the history of the Jews. And so he wrote some very important works, one of which is called the Antiquities of the Jews, and another one which is called the Wars of the Jews. And in the one called Antiquities, in one passage, he does actually describe what the tradition was about the gemstones, which they believe to have been the Urim and Thummim. As gemstones with facets, Josephus believed that because of the way light passed through the gemstone, that it would refract, and in that refraction would produce some sort of indication of answers to questions that were posed. It would have produced some kind of flashing lights. Now, this sounds a little odd to us, and we don't really have enough description, even in Flavius Josephus, to know exactly how this was supposed to have worked, other than just the brief description that he gives. But that is at least one idea about how the Urim and the Thummim were actually used. However, there is another idea that is dependent upon the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was made a couple of centuries before the time of Jesus. Especially in the Septuagint rendering of 1 Samuel 14 and 41, there seems to have been a process by which the Urim and the Thummim were used to cast lots. In fact, let me just read from the Septuagint, and I'll read it translate it into English as I read, but let me read an English version of the Septuagint of 1 Samuel 14:41, which was in the situation in which Saul, the first king of Israel, was trying to decide between two groups of people and who were at fault in something. And so Saul says, "O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant today? Is the iniquity in me, or is it in my son Jonathan? Lord God of Israel, give clear manifestations. And if the lot should declare this, give, I pray thee, to thy people Israel, give, I pray thee, holiness." And Jonathan and Saul are taken, and the people escaped. So in this particular situation, lots are cast between the family of Saul and the rest of Israel. And in this case, Saul and Jonathan are indicated as the family at which the fault lies. Of course, if you read the whole story, you'll find that Jonathan is eventually going to be the one who is indicted here. But the important thing, at least for our purposes, is that the Urim and the Thummim were used to cast lots to decide between groups. Some have suggested that perhaps the Urim and the Thummim had markings on them, sort of like X's and O's, probably not X's and O's, but something that would, so that when two of them were cast, if both of them came up with X's, that would be sort of like a yes answer. If both of them came up with zeros, that would be like a no answer. And if they came up with one X and one zero, it was time to throw again and try to get a more definitive answer. Again, that's just a guess as to how these implements were used. But however they were used, here in the book of Ezra, they were going to be used to decide which people had a pure pedigree and which people were to be excluded from pure Israelites. Slide 68. In the listing of gifts for the temple, which are given in chapter 2 and verse 69, you'll notice that there were 61,000 drachmas of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly garments. The priestly garments is fairly straightforward. These were some kind of linen garments for the priesthood. The 5,000 minas of silver, a mina is a weight, and this approximates about 3 tons of silver. The term 61,000 drachmas is a little different, though, because a drachma is a coin. Now, specifically, a drachma is a Greek coin. However, it seems a little odd that people coming from Persia would be bringing offerings in Greek coinage. Even though drachmas may have been known as early as this, they certainly would have been unusual for someone coming from Persia. And for that reason, many scholars, in fact, probably most scholars, believe that the term drachma is simply substituted for the term derek. The Persian coinage at this time was called a derek, and this was one of the earliest coinages in the ancient world. Coinage itself was a pretty new phenomenon in the ancient world, and it only became a medium of exchange beginning in about the mid-6th century BC when Croesus of Sardis, Asia Minor, had begun minting coins. The Persians learned about the minting of coins when Sardis and Asia Minor became part of the larger Persian Empire. And so the Persians adopted this practice and began to coin some of their own money. And you see the examples that are given in slide 68. This is an actual gold derrick that was introduced in Persia by Darius I sometime in his reign. And of course, that is the period of which we're talking about. So many scholars believe that when it's mentioned 61,000 drachmas, it's probably referring to 61,000 Persian derricks or 61,000 coins. And some of the returning exiles would have brought their gifts in coinage. Slide 69. The Jews also began coining their own coins during the period of Persian rule. The place where the Jews lived in and around Jerusalem was called Yehud. In this particular coin that you see in slide 69, this is a coin that was minted near Jerusalem a little bit later than the time we're talking about. This one comes from about 370 BC. But it is a striking silver coin of the type that was beginning to be used in the world as a medium of exchange. This particular Jewish coin has a falcon on it, and it has an Aramaic inscription. You'll see the inscription in Aramaic letters on the right side of the coin. And those letters are the three letters of the word Yehud, a trilateral root meaning the province of Judah. Slide 70. One of the Psalms describes the people of Israel coming back to Jerusalem. The Psalms, of course, were composed over a wide period of time. Some of them, at least one of them, going all the way back to the time of Moses. And, of course, many of the Psalms are linked to the name of David. Some are linked to Solomon. Some are linked to various people within the temple orchestra and choir masters. But this particular one, Psalm 126, seems to be referring to the period when the people first came back to Jerusalem from Persia. It begins with the majestic words, when Yahweh brought back the captives to Zion. And Zion, of course, is the mountain where the temple was supposed to be built or rebuilt. When Yahweh brought back the captives to Zion, we were like men who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. And then it was said among the nations, Yahweh has done great things for them. Yahweh has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. The first flush of exuberance and excitement is captured in the opening phrases of this psalm. In all, about 50,000 people returned from Babylon to Jerusalem, according to the book of Ezra. Well, this is quite a large group of people, a large group of repatriates. Coming back to Jerusalem in this long trek from Babylon, which was probably approximately 1,000 miles, they came back with great hopes. They came back with expectations that when they returned, God would be with them and that he would assist them in the building of the temple. Now, one of the interesting things you will find, again, this has to do with a numbers issue, a mathematical one. The numerical tally in the book of Ezra is different from the one in Nehemiah chapter 7, beginning in verse 8. But they are both describing the original returning group. Why these discrepancies exist, again, are not entirely clear, similar to the other discrepancies we found with regard to the temple vessels. Presumably, these discrepancies are due to the problem of scribal transmission. And through the centuries, some numbers have been transcribed incorrectly or have dropped out of the text, something of that nature. But we don't know that for sure. We just know that the listing that is given in Ezra is different from the one that is in Nehemiah. One interesting thing about those who came back, however, is the fairly large number of slaves that were among the returning group. About 1 out of every 6 were slaves. And so that seems to suggest that many of the families were quite wealthy. Usually it would only be a wealthy family that would have someone serving in their household as a servant or a slave. And so from these wealthy families, there came some very substantial gifts, which were given to help with the rebuilding project. Even though the Persian government had promised to subsidize the rebuilding of the temple, there was still a lot of extra expense involved in such a huge building project. And so these substantial gifts that are listed here were given and stockpiled for the use of those who would build the temple. Slide 71. This is just an interesting artifact that relates to the time period about which we're talking. Not too long ago, there was a stone seal that was excavated. It's about 2,500 years old and dates to about the mid-6th century to the mid-5th century BC. It has a 4-letter inscription, a quadrilateral root in the Hebrew letters of Shin, Lamed, Mem, and Tau. It also has some figures on it, as you can see, somewhat dim, but they can actually be made out as human figures. Professor Anson Rainey, who is emeritus professor of ancient Near Eastern culture and Semitic linguistics at Tel Aviv University in Palestine, or in Israel, suggests that this quadrilateral root could in fact be connected to the group of returning exiles. There are 2 places where this might be possible. One of them is in 1 Chronicles 3:19, in which a daughter of Zerubbabel is described as Shelomith, and this particular name has the same 4 consonants that you find on this stone seal. So if that's the case, then this stone seal would represent the seal of a daughter of one of the leaders of the returning exiles. The other possibility is actually in Ezra, chapter 8 and verse 10, which lists some of the families returning to Jerusalem, and one of the family names is the same as the name Shelomith, which has the 4 quadrilateral consonantal roots. And so in this case, the name would be of a man rather than a woman, but both names, both the daughter of Zerubbabel and the name of this family coming to Jerusalem, have the same basic consonantal roots as we find on this ancient stone seal. Now, probably it will be impossible to validate for certain whether this stone seal relates to either of these 2 persons that are mentioned in the Bible. But still, the possibility is certainly there. And because it is not a particularly common name, that increases the chances of this being an artifact of one of those groups who returned from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And so that concludes Lecture 7.